In this Warmaster video, we are going to explore the Warmaster Revolution rules for building and picking an army. All current legal army lists are available for free from the Warmaster Revolution website. Also free to use is the online Army Builder app for Warmaster Revolution. Please see the links below. So let us assume that you've just got into Warmaster and wants to build an army, but you're not sure where to start. The first army list in the book is the Empire Army, so let us use this as an example. We can see that there are a wide variety of troop types, but what does this information actually mean? The most important information to start with is the minimum and maximum unit column. This will tell you what units and characters you have to include in your army for every 1,000 points, and also tells you what other units and characters you may include for every 1,000 points. Every single army list must include one general, no more, no less. For every 1,000 points spent, the Empire Army must include 2 units of halberdiers and 2 units of crossbowmen. So we have complied with the minimum unit requirements for our Empire Army at 1,000 points. So we now have free range to pick whatever units and characters we wish to build the army up to 1,000 points. However, we cannot exceed the maximum number of units permitted per 1,000 points, shown in the column on the right. If there is no maximum number of units listed, then we can pick as many units of that type as we can afford. In this example army, we've gone for a little bit of everything, with one of each unit type available from the rest of the list. This is a fine approach to take for your first few games of Warmaster, whilst you are learning what units fulfill what roles within your army. So we've picked our units, we've painted them up, and we're ready to play with them. But there are 2 more things we need to check to ensure our army is legal. Firstly, we need to calculate the army's breakpoint. This will be half the total number of units in the army, rounding up. You must supply your opponent with this information. In this army, the breakpoint is 5. We must also ensure that our army complies with the total points value. In this example, we are 10 points short, so we can purchase a magic item to give to a hero to bring us up to 1,000 points. We also need to think about how our units will interact on the battlefield. This army comprises melee infantry, missile infantry, cavalry and artillery. Empire infantry units are quite weak compared to other armies, so we may decide to brigade all our core infantry units together for mutual support. The cavalry units are the fastest in the army, so it would make sense to brigade them together as well. Likewise, the artillery are the slowest units, so it makes sense to keep them together. This leaves the flagellants and the steam tank as single units. Both of these units can be used to protect the more vulnerable infantry and artillery brigades. For example, you might wish to put the flagellants in front of the army, as they cannot be driven back by enemy shooting. Alternatively, you could put the flagellants to protect the artillery, as they have a lot of attacks, and use the steam tank to draw enemy fire by placing it in front of the rest of the army, as it is very hard to destroy. Alternatively, you might wish to focus all your shooting power in one brigade which stands at the front of the army. The flagellants could then be added to the halberdier units to make a more formidable melee infantry brigade. Part of the fun of Warmaster is experimenting with different unit types and finding an army build that works for you. Games of Warmaster are won by the player who scores the most victory points. The easiest way to score victory points is to kill enemy units. If you kill enough enemy units, the enemy army will break and the game will end. which usually means you have won. One of the best ways to kill off the enemy is the use of hammer units. A typical hammer unit is one that has the ability to focus a large number of attacks across a relatively small frontage. Examples include cavalry units, chariot units, monsters, and fanatic-style infantry. In the Empire Army, the best hammer units are knights. Lots and lots of knights. Hammer units work well in conjunction with anvil units. Anvil units are sturdy enough to hold the line against enemy attacks, giving you enough time to maneuver your own hammer units into the enemy's flank. A typical anvil unit will have a large number of hits and a good armor save. Examples include dwarf warriors, chaos warriors, and ogres. The Empire Army does not have any infantry units that fit this description. However, you can build an anvil from the modest halberdier units simply by fielding a large number of them. You can also make weak infantry units into a good anvil by placing them in defensible terrain. Shooting is an important tactical part of Warmaster. You are unlikely to win any games simply by shooting the enemy to death, as the role of missile troops is to disrupt the enemy rather than cause mass casualties. The Empire Army can field a wide variety of missile troops, although you may find it hard to concentrate their fire, as each unit must shoot at the closest visible enemy. Artillery units enable you to project force across the battlefield, forcing the enemy to come to you. Artillery units are a very good counter against armoured infantry, armoured cavalry, and monsters. Empire armies can field cannon, which are the strongest artillery pieces in the game. Expendable units also offer you another tactical option. They can be placed in front of your more valuable units in order to draw enemy missile fire. They can also be used to bait enemy units into charges away from their support. The Empire Army can use any of its infantry units or pistoliers as expendable units. Harassment units such as flyers or light cavalry excel at disrupting the enemy's command structure. These units are fast enough to move behind enemy lines and impose the command penalty for enemy proximity. They often also have shooting attacks to help break up enemy brigades and cause confusion. In the Empire Army, pistoliers perform this role. A force multiplier is anything that will increase your chances of winning a combat whilst decreasing the enemy's chances of winning the same combat. Character pieces with additional attacks are an example of a force multiplier. The best force multiplier in Warmaster is Terror, so bringing a terrifying unit or a character mounted on a terrifying monster is your best option. The best force multiplier for the Empire Army is a hero mounted on a griffin with a magic sword. Magic can be thought of as another type of force multiplier. You should not rely on magic to win you the game. Instead, it can be used to boost your shooting, buff your units in combat, or disrupt the enemy. Empire Wizard characters also have access to one of the best spell lists in the game. A good army list should try and incorporate as many of these unit types as possible. If we expend our Empire Army to 2000 points, the hammer in this army is 5 units of knights and 2 units of flagellants. 2 units of cannon provide artillery. A unit of pistoliers can be used either for harassment or as an expendable unit. And our force multipliers are 2 wizards and the hero with the Sword of Might being mounted on a griffin. Choosing how many characters to take can pose a problem. You need to make sure you have sufficient characters to command each of your brigades. A good rule of thumb is to include at least one Command 8 character per 1000 points of your army, in addition to the general. It's always fun to experiment with different army builds. For example, you might want to build the ultimate horde army with a breakpoint so high the enemy will never reach it. If you choose to do this, you may have a lot of fun, but you're unlikely to win, as although the enemy may never reach your breakpoint, he'll simply beat you on victory points. And if you have no hammer units of your own, you're never going to break the enemy. Conversely, if you take an army comprised of only elite hammer units, you may find that your army is so small it is easily broken, as even the strongest unit in isolation is vulnerable to being outmaneuvered, outflanked and dragged down. A well-rounded Warmaster Army list will have sufficient cheap units to keep the breakpoint high, and sufficient strong units to inflict enough damage on the enemy to win you the game. A question that is often raised by players who are new to Warmaster, especially if they have previously played games such as Warhammer Fantasy Battles, is why are there no units of this or that type within the Warmaster Army list? Now, it is true that Warmaster is based upon the Warhammer fantasy world, and the majority of Warmaster armies are based upon a Warhammer equivalent. Well, one reason is that Warmaster is a very old game. It was written in the year 2000 when Warhammer was still in its 6th edition. So this means a lot of the Warmaster lists would have been based upon 6th edition Warhammer lists and the troop types available to them. However, Warmaster is designed to be a game on a completely different scale. The unit entries in a Warmaster army list represent hundreds of troops, so the most representative units for each race have been selected. You might imagine that there would be more elite versions of certain troops mixed in amongst the formations, but their individual impact upon the general flow of the battle would not be significant enough to warrant a separate profile. Taking the Empire army list as an example, we can see that there are no entries for swordsmen, or spearmen, or free company, or great swords. The halberdier profile represents all of these units. Likewise, there are no demigryph knights or knights of the White Wolf. They are all just knights. This approach actually allows for an awful lot of freedom when selecting what models to use in your army. You are free to choose whatever models you wish to represent the units in your army, provided you let your opponent know which profile you intend to represent them in the game. If you wish to distinguish a certain unit as being more elite than its counterparts, then the game permits you to grant them a magic item to represent their elite status. For example, this could be a magic banner or a magic sword. For example, in this Vampire Counts army, the vampire player has picked 4 units of Black Knights. However, 2 of the units of Black Knights have been painted to represent Blood Knights. To differentiate them on the battlefield, the Blood Knight units have both been given a 10-point magic sword. But what happens if you've bought and painted some models to represent troops you would like to field in your army, but there's simply nothing within the army list selection that represents their unit type? For example, in my Tomb King's army, I have a unit of Ushabti and a unit of Tomb Guard. So looking at the Tomb King's army selector, the only infantry type suitable to represent these units are skeletons. Skeletons are the worst infantry unit in the game, and no amount of magic items is going to make them represent a unit of Tomb Guard or a unit of Ushabti. My solution is to use these units to represent Raised Dead. Whenever a spell is cast by a Lich Priest and a new unit is summoned, I will use Tomb Guard or Ushabti, even if the stat line does not do the models justice. It also helps to distinguish my Raised Dead units from my skeleton units. There is, of course, nothing to stop you creating your own units and adding them to existing army lists for the purposes of playing friendly games to try out units you have always wanted to field. Now you should always seek your opponent's permission to do this, and you should base your additional unit choices on existing unit profiles from other lists. So let's say we wanted to create a stat line for Tomb Guard. Well, an equivalent unit already exists in the Vampire Count's army list called Grave Guard. So all we need to do is rename this unit Tomb Guard, and it becomes an entry in the Tomb King's list. When doing this though, be careful not to add too many good units to an existing list. To avoid making an existing list too powerful, limit any units you invent to 1 per 1,000. We can also go through the same process to come up with a profile to represent Ushabti units. Now Ushabti are giant humanoid constructs about the same size as ogres, so we can give them a profile similar to that. Looking at the Orc list, we see that ogres cost 105 points, but beware, ogres have a negative special rule which reduces their points cost. Luckily there is another unit in the Orc list with exactly the same profile and no special rules. They are Black Orcs and they cost 110 points. So our Ushabti without any special rules should also cost 110 points. Having created 2 new units for our army, it is only fair that we replace 2 other units. In this case, the Bone Giant and Sphinx monsters have been replaced with our Tomb Guard and Ushabti infantry. This helps to prevent the list from being overpowered, whilst allowing you to add some variety to your games, without changing the way the list is designed to be played. I would add a word of caution before anyone decides to rip up the existing armies book and set about to design their own. Warmaster is an evolving game, and all the current approved army lists in the Warmaster Revolution book have gone through a rigorous process of playtesting and checking. All current Warmaster armies are viable, and it is using these lists that the game is supposed to be played. If you would like to contribute your own ideas as to army list design, please make use of the Experimental Rules forum using the link below.